How can businesses in the 21st century continue to grow while delivering an absolute reduction in their environmental impact? This was the question posed at a recent RSA and PepsiCo roundtable to discuss the challenges of decoupling economic growth from increased carbon emissions and to explore solutions. The event included provocations from Stephanie Draper, a director at the Forum for the Future, who shared progress to date, giving examples of organisations who are achieving absolute reductions in their environmental impact, and from Professor Tim Jackson of the Sustainable Development Commission on the limitations of decoupling and the need for a new model of ecological enterprise. Drawing from his detailed report, Prosperity Without Growth, here Tim Jackson discusses the dilemma of growth.
I'm here to talk about, let's sort of divide it illustratively between a long game and a short game. And Prosperity Without Growth, which some people may have heard of and fewer will have read, is mainly about the long game, and both, it seems to me, are important. I was on the train this morning and there was a guy, in the way that you do, I overheard his conversation. It wasn't intrusive or anything, it was just interesting. And he said, "My long game's good, but I can't get the ball in the hole." And it seemed, I'm not a golf player, but I assumed he was talking about golf. It's possible he could have been talking about something else. But it is a sort of reminder that actually the long game and the short game are both important. And one of the criticisms of Prosperity Without Growth, certainly from those in policy, is that it doesn't address the short game enough. Nonetheless, I would like to applaud anything which attempts to look at the long game, because it is ultimately those difficult, tough questions about structure, about macroeconomic scale, that are going to determine whether or not we meet any carbon targets. So, first of all, dilemma of growth. It's a chapter title in Prosperity Without Growth, and may have had some provenance in the title of this session, I don't know. But the point to me is very clear, and it hasn't been talked about a lot. The dilemma of growth is this: growth is unsustainable, at least in its current form. Even Ed Miliband actually doesn't disagree with that. He says it's high carbon growth that's unsustainable, and we can get low carbon growth, and he might be right. I'm not going to dispute that at this point in time, but nobody really disagrees that growth is unsustainable. And actually, in very simple heuristic terms, on a finite planet, something which keeps growing is going to push against some boundaries at some point. And so ultimately, one could argue there are some limits there that need to be taken into account, and that certainly haven't yet. It wouldn't be a dilemma if that was all there was to it. The other side of the dilemma is that degrowth is unstable, basically. It's unstable at the macroeconomic level. We sort of see the impacts of that in something like the recession, fears of economic collapse, and it's even at the micro level, at the level of firms which don't grow have to think very, very, very carefully about their structure. They have to institutionalize themselves in very specific ways. They have to have the right shareholder structure, they have the right legal framing, and they have to work very, very hard not to grow. So that's the dilemma, and it is a very real dilemma. It's not a dilemma that we can pull solutions off the shelf for very easily, and it's so profound that you kind of want to know where's the answer, and why aren't those who are, for example, responsible for 80% cuts in carbon emissions by 2050, why aren't they grasping this firmer, harder, and with more alacrity? And it's not strictly true to say that they aren't. I mean, actually, there is a response to the dilemma of growth, and it is basically, as Stephanie pointed out, is the idea of decoupling. And so we can keep having more and more economic activity, but we'll make that more and more efficient. We'll reduce our resource inputs, we'll reduce our carbon outputs, water consumption, impact on biodiversity, land use, etc., etc. And in that way, we will separate out nicely our increasing economy from our ecological limits and our declining resource throughput. That is the de rigueur solution on the table to the dilemma of growth. And the real point is to question whether it's sufficient, whether actually it will deliver the targets, whether we are delivering the targets. Nobody really disputes that over actually 150 years or so, it's been possible for companies to create value by exploiting resource efficiencies, and therefore to have a high output for a lower resource throughput than we did when we were building steel plants that were fired by coal and incredibly inefficient 150 years ago. So that's, that existence of that dividend, if you like, that ability of companies to extract value from resource efficiency is never in dispute. There's masses and masses of anecdotal examples of it. The difficulty is that there are some real limits to that strategy when it comes to macroeconomic scale. And here's a few of them. One is efficiency, absolutely excellent. Stephanie's kind of pointed to this, but it's always balanced against scale. So you get more and more efficient, but if your output's going up, if it exceeds the rate at which you improve efficiency, then you get growth. And actually, at the macroeconomic level, at the level of the world as a whole, that is exactly what we see. The evidence of absolute decoupling in terms of resources, in terms of fossil fuels, in terms of carbon, is scant, disappearing. It doesn't exist. There is no evidence of that at global scale. So scale has outweighed efficiency consistently. And there are some reasons for that. One of them is that as you do things more efficiently, things become cheaper, so you can afford to produce more output, and people will consume more of it because it's cheaper, so you get a rebound effect. And that rebound effect is one of the things that stops efficiency, leading to reductions in scale. Another is trade boundaries. Really, really interesting how malleable trade boundaries are, and very, very simple things that companies can do to reduce their own carbon footprint at the expense of carbon somewhere else, either in the UK economy or in another company, or indeed across the boundary. I was fascinated by the Vodafone BT example. I would love to know, for example, how much of that carbon reduction is going to be achieved by offshoring data centers to other countries. And data centers are incredibly carbon intensive. You know, that sort of thing is so easy to do. And even at the level of the UK economy as a whole, when you look at the data that says that we are reducing our carbon as accounted for under the Kyoto Protocol since 1990. That works if you take the Kyoto Protocol as the means of accounting for carbon. But if you say, actually, we need to look at the carbon embodied in the traded goods that come into the UK economy, 3 separate studies have all shown that actually you reverse that. And we're looking at carbon growth in the UK, even within the UK, if you attribute all the carbon associated with traded goods to the UK. So those trade boundaries, the rebound effect, the question of scale versus efficiency, all mitigate against any simple allegiance to anecdotal evidence of efficiency improvement at the company level. It's not happening, and the evidence shows that quite clearly. And then when you look at what's required in order to achieve the kind of carbon targets that we need to achieve by 2050, you find actually that the level of intensity improvement, reduction in carbon intensity that you need is huge. It's a couple of orders of magnitude. It's 130 times if you want to get by 130 times reduction in the carbon intensity of every dollar of output, global output, if you want to get to an equitable world in which everybody can afford a Western lifestyle with the assumption of 2% growth up to 2050. And of course, if you want the economy to grow beyond that, to 2100, actually you've got to reduce it another 3 times. So you need basically a kind of a carbon intensity per dollar of output that's very, very, very close to zero. And under some scenarios, less than zero. You need economic activities and an economy as a whole which is taking carbon out of the atmosphere consistently. Maybe you can do it by the car thing. I don't know. Again, a fascinating anecdote. And I think a second volume for Jeremy Leggett's Carbon Wars, where the war is now over claiming other people's carbon reduction credits as fast as possible. But at the macroeconomic level, does it actually deliver the carbon reductions we want? How do we have an economy? What are the economic activities in an economy which is taking carbon out of the atmosphere? That's the long game. That's what we need to think about. Prosperity without growth goes into a lot of that data. It talks a lot about the dynamic. I think given when you look at the starkness of that dilemma and the inadequacy of the solution of decoupling under current conditions, you're drawn inevitably to question the structure of the economy. And we, in the report, the 2 particular aspects of it that we question. One is the macroeconomic structure, which hands down a certain set of institutional rules about what growth is and how it's achieved and how stability is achieved within the macroeconomy. And the other is a kind of social logic in which actually we are all implicated because our lives are so embedded in carbon and in material goods for all sorts of reasons. Some of them, possibly, as critics would argue, about greed, but many of them actually about the basic fundamental task of creating a social world and finding a credible place in it. Adam Smith talked about the need to achieve a life without shame. And the whole question really, we could put it in a nutshell, how can we organize a society in which people can achieve a life without shame that isn't dependent on a continual ratchet of increasing materialistic consumption? Now, that's idealistic, that's a very long game, maybe, but that is ultimately, what we want if we want to have a prosperous society, a society in which it's possible for people to do well without the material implications. We have to tease ourselves off this materialistic ratchet, and we have to restructure the way we think about the economy. The report goes into a lot of that, and I'm not going to talk about it much here. One of the things that's really important, though, really interesting that comes out of that is the theme of investment. Economies are not just about consumption, they're also about investment, and the balance between consumption and investment is one of the interesting macroeconomic tensions that you can play with in thinking about how to get a different kind of economy. And indeed, some people have begun to do that. There are one or two sort of examples of politicians and models, which academic models, which are beginning to make sounds in that direction, that investment is now incredibly important. It's important, as we know, not just because it's a component in the macroeconomy, but also because we need a considerable amount of investment in order to achieve a low-carbon transition. So there's a sort of bringing together of two ideas, an opportunity, a window of change around investment and rethinking investment that is potentially very, very fertile. There's an interesting point about that kind of investment, though, which is that if you expand the investment in the economy and you target it, let's call it ecological investment. You target it at ecological investment. What is that? That's investment in energy efficiency, in renewables, in resource productivity, perhaps in ecosystem maintenance and restoration, possibly in adaptation, a whole set of tasks where we need investment capital to be flowing. Is that investment going to behave the same way in your economy as the old school of investment, which was high return, high productivity stuff, essentially targeted towards improving productive capacity in the economy? And I think when you look at it in detail, you have to say, no, it's not. It performs differently. It's a different investment ecology. It has different periods of return. It has different rates of return associated with it. It doesn't give you back the conventional growth-based economy in any meaningful way unless you expand your debt, which at this point is exactly the wrong thing to do. So there's a task there. It's a very specific task. It's about modeling this new economy and thinking in different ways about investment structure, capital markets, the way they're operated, and the role of the public sector versus the private sector in that investment ecology. So that's a bit of an aside, really, a throwaway. The thing that I really want to kind of come round to, and it's this thing in a way that connects the long game to the short game, just to come back to my opening analogy, is that what's the role of business in this? How do businesses conceive themselves? What is economic activity in this new economy? And it seems to me that actually we have a lot of things in place already because we know kind of what we want. I'm going to call this ecological enterprise. It's social, it builds in some sense on the model of social enterprise. And the model of social enterprise is interesting because it allows for structures which don't tie businesses to what Peter referred to as a kind of a set of internal drivers which constrain how they can operate. And as a model, it is, I think, absolutely critical to say, what's the learning from social enterprise? What's the learning from saying there are different models of shareholder value, there's different models of shareholder interest, there's different ways in which we structure dividends, there's different ways in which the company interacts with the community, there's different requirements placed on the company to benefit the community. All of that stuff is brought up by social enterprise and the ideas of social enterprise. The Community Interest Companies Act of 2005, I think it is, is a classic piece of legislation, a really possibly ground-changing piece of legislation in terms of developing the possibilities for ecological enterprise. So ecological enterprise, I'm just going to throw this concept at you and say, actually, it's a very interesting concept. And if you like, you could start from one of the responses to the dilemma of growth is to say, yes, we need a different kind of economy, and we need a different engine of growth. UNEP has been quite explicit about this point. They've called very strongly a different engine of growth. What is this engine? What are these activities? When you come down to it, it looks very much like what's being called for is a kind of renewal of the idea of a service-based economy. These aren't services dedicated to retail and distribution and marketing. They're not services post the crash in the financial services sector. They are services in the idea of activities that provide services. They provide the capabilities for human flourishing in a number of different ways, in health, in education, in participation, in leisure, of course in the basics like food and housing and renovation and maintenance. All of that activity remains important, activity in relation to the infrastructure, but also the activities that facilitate our ability to participate in the life of society. Is there any reason why we couldn't construct an economy that looked like that, in which those were the basis of ecological enterprise? It seems as though there isn't. There's just one catch, and it is this, that basically those kinds of enterprises do almost exactly what you might want them to do. They could be low carbon, they could be carbon capped, they could be resource efficient, they could be resource limited, they could soak up employment massively, so they could provide lots of jobs for people, they could support and be embedded in communities, and they could provide lots of capabilities for people to flourish. But when you look at that sector in the economy, when you look at the data around the productivity of those kinds of sectors in the economy, and it is largely because they are so good at soaking up jobs, you find they have very, very, very poor labour productivity. So the rub is, it's a different engine, but without improvements in labour productivity, you basically don't get growth. You have a different engine, but it isn't an engine of growth. Does it matter? I think not. I think here is a definition of ecological enterprise that makes sense, that respects limits, that contributes to flourishing, that provides jobs, and is a vision for what companies should be. And that can be something maybe still quite a long game, certainly for bigger companies that are hard to turn around, but actually quite clear short-term initiatives that can be taken, steps that can be taken in that direction. I'm going to stop there.